Ilya Lozovsky is the co-author of a research article that investigated nearly 50,000 internal emails obtained from a Russian foundation that pitches itself as offering legal aid to Russian compatriots abroad. In fact, Prav Fond also helps numerous spies, criminals, and blatant propagandists. It works hand in glove with the Russian intelligence services and builds networks of Russian influence around the world. Today, we're going to be discussing this detailed look at the inner workings of an influence machine that seeks to turn every Russian in the world into an agent of the Kremlin. Ilya Lozovsky is a senior editor and writer at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP, and is an investigative journalist with experience in democracy and corruption. Based in Amsterdam, he writes about the intersection of corruption and democracy, covers Russia, Ukraine, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Ilya was a key editor on OCCRP's award-winning Plunder and Patronage and Matraimov Kingdom projects about smuggling and money laundering in Central Asia. Ilya's work has also appeared in Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Haaretz, and many, many other outlets. Ilya, welcome to the channel.
Thanks very much for having me. Glad to be here.
We will, of course, put a link to the detailed article in the description. And if people find this topic fascinating, I suggest they sort of check that out and then more widely check out the reporting and investigations of your organization. Now, could you put this in context? Why this report? Why now? Why was it so important to sink, so much resource into uncovering this story?
Well, in investigative journalism, sometimes you go with what you have. So we had access to these tens of thousands of emails thanks to our partners, our Danish partners. And of course, we would have been interested to look into this in any case. But obviously, Russian influence in the world, aside from the obvious invasion of Ukraine, is a big topic and a big concern, especially in Europe, which is where this organization is especially active. So I think that's always interesting. For me personally, it's really interesting. As someone, I was born in Russia. I moved to the United States when I was young, but I'm someone who still, very much admires Russian culture, and I care a lot about speaking the language. So for me, it's interesting and to see how those things are actually weaponized by the Russian state, because this organization bills itself as, Pravfond. This organization bills itself as supporting Russian compatriots abroad, and a lot of the stuff they do is, has to do with Russian language and culture, and they claim that Russians are discriminated against, and a lot of the stuff will like appeal to people who are not political. If you're just a Russian maybe expatriate who has children and you want them to go to a Russian language class, you might be interested in organizations that do that. But this organization provides support, among other things, for kind of those cultural things. And it's like actually a part of a much larger picture how the Russian state tries to weaponize Russians abroad. It's actually part of the Russian constitution now that Russian compatriots, as they call them, are, they need to be protected against Russophobia, against various anti-Russian initiatives, and that they also are seen as an asset for telling Russia's story to the world. And of course, in the parlance of the Kremlin, that means telling the pro-Kremlin narratives to
And
the
of
world.
course, like those long-suffering Russian-speaking Ukrainians, the Kremlin is going to come and protect their interests, whether they want those interests protected or not.
Of course, that was one of the main, remains one of the main justifications for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that you need to go in and protect the Russian compatriots. We actually, when we were thinking of how to name the project, our project is called Dear Compatriots, and we kind of were thinking about this and thinking, well, the word compatriot doesn't come up that often in English. It's not necessarily the best word in English, but we ended up going for it because it actually is such a key concept, in the Russian world. It's not just an expat, it's a political category, as we said, of Russians who are meant to be supporting, Moscow's policies, meant to be coming to Moscow for protection, and that's exploited in all kinds of ways. So I think this organization is a really perfect example of that approach to dealing with the world, even though, it's not huge amounts of money compared to maybe some other efforts. it's certainly several million dollar, the equivalent of several million dollars a year. But we do find digging through these tens of thousands of email and looking at all the projects that they funded, they get a lot of bang for their buck.
And we'll dig into some of those patterns because, of course, the kind of projects that get approved and get funded tell us quite a lot about the intent of the Russian state. But while we're on that word compatriots, I mean, that's the word that Andrei Soldatov and Irina Baragan chose for their book as well, again, about the weaponization of the Russian business community and expat community abroad. So I think it's a fascinating concept. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? And we were just briefly discussing it before we hit record. On the one hand, it's there to provide support, and like RT, it may be that 80–90% of the activity could be classed as relatively innocuous and politics free. It's the little bit, that's the sugar coating that allows the sort of bitter tasting medicine to be ingested, isn't it? But also knowing that this fund is there to help. There's an inverse of that amongst the Russian diaspora, which is knowing that this fund exists amongst them. So it's there to help, but it's also there perhaps to coerce. Because if you're looking to oppose the Russian regime, you may have this deep sense that they are everywhere. You cannot escape their influence and their eye.
And we found, actually looking into this, a lot of the people who receive funding from Prafond are kind of pretty central figures in the Russian diaspora in their countries. We find this in Germany, we found this in Belgium, where the same people are running Russian language classes for children and cultural events. And, in some cases at the same time, we have this case in Germany of a man who runs various Russian events around Erfurt, and he's also receiving instructions from GRU. And he's receiving money from Prafond, which we should note is sanctioned by the European Union since June 2023. So we found quite a bit of assistance continuing. Funding, grant making by Prafond continuing after 2023. Basically, it paying a lot of legal fees for Russians who need them. And in some cases, as you mentioned, those are fairly innocuous things, someone going through a divorce or someone who needs access to mental health services or something. But in the eyes of these people who run this organization, there's kind of a continuum from those cases to the much more, problematic cases of people convicted of espionage, people convicted of crimes, people
Uh,
who
Gun
present.
running, I mean, one of the cases we'll get to is Victor Bout. So that's about as extreme as it gets in terms of fighting for the Russian state on a military kind of level.
And we can see how they justify, there was a case, I thought a quite interesting case we came across was all the way from Australia, of a man who he calls himself the Aussie Cossack. And he was not even a Russian citizen. He was just someone who had Russian roots, and he grew up in Australia, and he went around justifying Russia's invasion of Ukraine and doing all kinds of provocative stunts and being this kind of comic provocateur, but also convicted of assault after assaulting a Ukraine supporter. And then he went and hid in the Russian consulate in Sydney. He's still there now, more than 2 years later. But if you look at the internal Parafon documents that we looked at, they describe him as someone who's being persecuted for, airing his pro-Russian views. And that's how they describe him internally. That's how they approve his request for help. That's how when they report on their own activity to the Russian Foreign Ministry, that's what they say. We help this man who's being persecuted for his views, without mentioning, he's being prosecuted because he assaulted somebody and because he's trying to escape justice. And they actually lobbied for him to get Russian citizenship. We have an email from the archive of emails that we obtained where he's writing them and he's thanking them and saying, thank you so much for your assistance with this. Finally, I've become a Russian citizen, thanks to a decree from President Putin. This has been a lifelong dream of mine.
And of course, before he tapped into this, he was busy spreading anti-COVID vaccine kind of conspiracy theories. So it's that interesting conjunction, isn't it, of extreme contrarianism, which seems to then naturally be drawn to Russian conspiratorial thinking as well.
And we see that, another example I could mention is another one of the grants that Pravfond provided was to host a virtual anti-fascism conference. It was I don't remember now which specific organization it was. I think it was nominally in Serbia, but really was online. And they invited guests from all over the world. And in every case, we looked at, who's the Norwegian guest, who's the German guest, who's the American guest. And there are all these kind of conspiracy theorists and just people who are way, way outside the mainstream in these countries. But then internally, they kind of present this as, oh, look, we have prominent people from a dozen countries agreeing with us and talking about how, of course, Ukrainian fascism is the reason that we had to invade. So it's like kind of clever because unless you're really kind of seeing all sides of the issue, if you're just seeing the Pravfond side, it's fairly convincing, the narratives that they portray. And we see actually even personal correspondence that the leaders of this organization are having, because some of the emails are not even really work related, but it's their personal correspondence, and they're kind of talking to old friends and talking about, I really believe Russia is on the correct historical path, and people in the West are getting tired of LGBT stuff and parent one and parent two, and they just want traditional values, and Russia is here to provide that. So internally, it's like a very coherent worldview that you can see how it could be quite convincing. And I'm just kind of a nerd for how these narratives are crafted. So you have to keep, I'm just find that really fascinating. At the same time, you have to continue to recognize all the lies they're telling and the horrible things that they're using this to justify. Even as we speak, continued attacks on Ukraine and murdering innocent people.
And it's incredible, isn't it? Because, I had a little hobby in the 90s, which was keeping a little notebook of what I thought of as historical mythology, or the myths that Russians told about, their own country. And I think at some point it becomes very difficult to figure out what has been manufactured and planted and repeated through propaganda, and which are almost naturally occurring myths. I think at this point it's impossible to say which are which. It's like sort of nature and nurture. All of it is in some ways weaponized. But one of those key myths, of course, is that I don't know. Karamazov got very irate with a correspondent on Channel 4 recently in the UK, where there was the implication that Russians are sort of incapable of democracy, and he got very angry at the idea that genetically Russians are incapable of democracy. But of course, that very idea is something you'll hear, and I have heard many, many Russians say, "Oh, well, it's okay for you, but this stuff just doesn't work with us." And they have a litany of reasons why that might be the case. This very idea that democracy is, genetically incompatible with Russian world values and identity, I think is something that they try to manufacture and then spread, including through organizations like this. So, what evidence did you have of sort of manufactured narratives of historical mythology, and I would also say an extreme curation of Russian literature? Because actually, there is some interesting stuff in Russian literature. There is some sort of revolutionary critical stuff, but I'm sure this organization was not promoting that kind of stuff. It was the usual Dostoevsky kind of thing that they try to push.
Yeah, you find the like Pushkin festivals and whatever, which I don't have a problem with Pushkin. I adore Pushkin, but they also are publishing textbooks that there's one textbook they published called The History of Lithuania, which I did not have a chance to read the entire 400 pages, but it does have an introduction by Sergei Lavrov, and it's just complete justification of the Soviet occupation, the annexation and occupation of Lithuania, and then the complete denial of the atrocities the Soviets committed there, and basically presenting Lithuania as a tool of the West to attack Russia, when of course the reality is completely the other way around. Of course, Lithuania has been a victim of Russian Soviet aggression for 100 years, if not longer. And one other interesting episode that I thought was fascinating that we found in our reporting is how Pravfond was used to really go after this concept of historical memory. And there was a quite high profile trial in Lithuania of Soviet military officers and officials who cracked down on civilians during the struggle for independence in 1991. And there was a kind of a famous episode where Soviet troops attacked a TV tower and some other places, and they killed, I think, about a dozen civilians. So years later, in the 2010s, Lithuania holds a trial of these former officials, about 62 of them, I think. And of course, the vast majority of them are now, living in Russia or somewhere else. So it's not like they're going to put most of them in prison, but it's sort of like, let's set the record straight. Let's convict them of war crimes. And Pravfond just went after this trial, and not only paying for the legal defense of some of the main people who were being prosecuted, but actually collaborating with representatives of the secret services, Russian security services, to undermine the trial. And there's a man who was convicted of espionage for trying to receiving an assignment from the FSB to collect the home addresses of the judges and prosecutors that were holding this trial. And Prafond has helped his legal defense, and they were just communicating all the time with all these people who the Lithuanian secret services identified as. This was all coordinated by the presidential administration and by the FSB, and Prafond is funding this kind of public relations campaign to tell the story to the world, how this is just persecution of Russians. So they're like, there was some previous reporting on Prafond that they had some intelligence ties, including some senior leadership. And this is another episode where we find them, as you said, hand in glove, working with Russian security services to undermine the judicial system in a neighboring state in a way that makes this argument that, Russians are only misunderstood and persecuted. And in fact, this like kind of historical battlefield is like a very painful point for them, you can tell, because they devote a lot of resources to it.
And of course, it's important because they have many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people working in the military intelligence, and of course, the Slovaki intelligence services. So you can see why they would devote that there. It's very clear signaling that we've got your back, not just on historical point, but to all the active agents that the regime relies upon to implement its policy.
Exactly. And reporters spoke with several European intelligence services, all of whom are watching this organization carefully, and they kind of know what it is. Maybe they don't know all the individual cases that our reporting revealed, but they sort of know what this is. And they say exactly this, that, the existence of this kind of organization, first you create a channel for funding that looks legitimate because a lot of the cases are benign. Then you graft the problematic cases on top of that to kind of hide it. And it becomes a mechanism to kind of reassure, whoever's in the field that there are ways to help you if anything goes wrong. And, the most high profile cases that we know of are Victor Boot. You mentioned the arms dealer whose lawyers received money from Prafond, and also the Krasikov, the assassin, the FSB assassin who killed the Chechen militant in Berlin. Both of those men were eventually transferred to Russia in prisoner exchanges. That was like, those are probably the most high profile cases, and we saw Prafond giving them money.
Well, these two questions are asked next. You may not be able to answer either of them actually, but let's give this a go. One is, I'm fascinated to learn how this reporting came about, how these confidential emails could have been received, and of course the logistics of actually then parsing them and researching them. It must be a tremendous amount of work. The other question is how on earth this organization is sanctioned. How on earth has it continued to function all these years and continue to support individuals, many of whom, as you say, quite clearly have close ties to Russian intelligence?
Well, the first question, I can't say anything about where the emails came from. I can say that doing an investigation like this involves a whole lot of work and organizational work and project management. And, this is why journalism is at the same time so important and requires resources, because the email, this kind of story crosses so many international boundaries. You can't be a reporter in one country and have any hope of grasping the whole story of what's going on. So that's why, we as OCCRP, we are a network, and that's how we work. We say it takes a network to fight a network. So the emails were obtained by DR, our partner in Denmark, and they basically came to us and said, can you guys help us organize an international collaboration? And then we have a lot of experience working with doing collaborative investigations. So we pulled together a bunch of partners. I think ended up being about 30 from various countries. And then everybody does their own local reporting of the cases in their country when Prafond came in and did whatever they did. So this requires, a centralized the emails are all kept in a centralized database that everyone has access to. There's various collaborative tools that we use to ensure that everybody has access. We all agree to share all our findings with each other. Everything is machine translated so that reporters who don't speak Russian can also access the materials. There's collaborative fact checking. Then you have to send requests for comment to everybody and to make sure you give everybody, you're writing about a chance to respond, and that has to be coordinated. So there's just a huge amount of project management and work. It takes months and months. I was asked by someone else recently, how long have you been working on this? And I was like trying to remember, and I said, I think 2 or 3 months. And then I looked back at the messenger group for the project, and I saw that it was created in January, actually. So it's been a long time, and the need always outstrips, the resources available. We could do another 10 stories, and there will be more stories coming, actually. So that partially answers your first question. Your second question was about how is
How does
Bravo.
it continue to
Yeah.
exist? Yeah.
Yeah, well, they're based in Moscow, so they have about 20 employees, I think, just off of Arbat Street in central Moscow, and they find ways of getting the money. First of all, the sanctions are only EU sanctions in this case, so anywhere outside the EU, they really don't have a problem. If it's in the EU, we see in the emails evidence of various schemes to get around the sanctions, and we have a separate story dedicated to that. But basically, it usually involves, paying somebody with a Russian bank account, and then they find some way of bringing cash over, or compensating a relative or something, or using companies. It's not. I think there's one quote I remember in some email. It's like we've been able to continue operating without a problem since. There are a few cases where it's like, oh, we're having trouble getting this money to this person, or there's a case where somebody in the Czech Republic had lawyers who were reluctant to accept money from Pravfond directly after the sanctions. But we also have many cases where the lawyers themselves don't know where the money came. The Pravfond just compensates the person, and then the lawyer just receives the money from their client, and they don't know, where the money is from originally.
Magically, their problems go away. I mean, it sounds very Godfather mafia kind of thing, doesn't it? Little Tsar, I have a problem. Can you sort it
Yes,
out?
yes, yes. Yes, but also it's like also funny to read the materials and to see how bureaucratic they are, and they have, there's like a formal if you want to get legal help from Pravfond, you have to fill out a formal application form, and if it's for legal help, you have to attach your contract with the lawyer to prove that you're really gonna get legal help, and then your passport scan, all this other stuff, and then after you receive the money, and then if the money doesn't go directly to you, but it's going to go to your spouse or a friend or something, then you have to have an official contract with them. And then once you receive the money and you spent it, then you have to send a report explaining, line by line how you spent the money. And then Pravfond will then report these things like to the Russian ministry. So, they have a little page on their website that's like, this is our anti-corruption policy, to make sure that Russian taxpayer money isn't wasted. So it's kind of funny how it's
Oh,
like
the
very
irony. The
boring.
irony of them having an anti-corruption policy, that is quite
Yeah.
something.
It's quite like boring and bureaucratic on some level, but it's also interesting that this is actually how this cloak and dagger stuff sometimes works, is through bureaucrats ticking boxes.
And there's lots of individual stories. We'll come to some of those in a minute because I think they are fascinating. But overall, what impression do you get from this? Because yes, there's lots of civil cases, etc., but there's also lots of projects funded. What does it tell us about the geopolitical priorities and strategy of the Kremlin?
I was surprised at how much propaganda was funded by Pravfond, because they bill themselves as an organization that defends the legal rights of Russians abroad. And a lot of the cases we've discussed so far is exactly, is that it's about funding legal defenses. But for all that, a considerable proportion of the grants that they make are actually not any kind of legal defense, but it's in fact propaganda work, and it's conferences, it's websites, it's Telegram channels, it's people doing all kinds of PR work, and a lot of stuff immortalizing the centrality of the Second World War in the Russian worldview. Probably it's, I mean, of course, it is well known, that this is the foundational myth, basically, of the modern Russian state, that we defeated Nazi Germany and therefore everything we do is okay. But every year there's commemorations of Stalingrad and celebrations of the Immortal Regiment and so much stuff centered on World War II. And I think that does tend to resonate with people because if you're not clued into these Kremlin strategies, if you're sort of a normal person, it's kind of widely known, the sacrifices the Soviet Union made to defeat Nazi Germany. And it's also sort of common, almost like a piece of folk wisdom, that the Russian contributions to that war are underappreciated because everybody knows the Americans defeated, and the Brits defeated Hitler, but really it was the Russians. So they weaponize this and say, well, look, we are presenting the truth here about Soviet contributions to defeat fascism. And now we're just trying to do the same thing again in Ukraine. Why can't you understand that? And so the way they weaponize these narratives is, I mean, it's not a surprise because they do this in the open, completely in the open. But I think a large amount of resources is dedicated to this. And you might, if I was in some random country and I saw some event taking place that was commemorating Stalingrad or something and it was run by any kind of organization that had Russians in it, I would immediately be like, I wonder if this is getting money from a sanctioned Russian entity, because odds are pretty good that it is.
And this great quote you've put in there from Edward Lucas, who, of course, is brilliant on this subject. And he's pointed out that it's not normal for countries to subsidize their citizens in foreign countries, their legal costs, let alone the sort of propagandistic activities. Well, it's perhaps more normal for some countries to subsidize their own form of propaganda. We have the British Council and so on. But private citizens' legal costs, that's very odd, isn't it? So there's an indication there of what the Russian state sort of values, and the use that the intelligence service might have for organizing this, especially when their actual embassies, which traditionally were the repository of a lot of GI agents, those have been really pared down, haven't they, for a whole variety of reasons, including the diplomats being chucked out.
Right. And yeah, this is something, I kind of thought about as I was reporting this. If I get into trouble here in Amsterdam as an American citizen and I'm arrested or something, I might get some advice from the consular department of the US Embassy, but I'm certainly not going to have my legal fees paid. And certainly it won't help me if I go around saying I love our president. I'm just an American whose American views are being suppressed because really I got in a drunken brawl somewhere or whatever. But this is the kind of, this over and over again, they're kind of, yes, we're giving money because this person is misunderstood because they're Russian because of Russophobia, even if they're just kind of basically committing crimes. All you have to do is to sort of loudly say that I'm being persecuted for my pro-Russian views, and the people in this country are fascists, and why can't I was only saying that Russian. Again, I was only talking about Russian contributions to the Second World War or whatever. Why am I being persecuted? So yeah, I mean it's pretty blatant manipulation, and they really believe in it. You can tell from these emails they really believe they're doing the right thing. I didn't see any kind of irony, any kind of like internal recognition that they didn't see any contradiction between what they believe and what they're doing. I think for them, it's a completely coherent worldview, which I thought was interesting because we are looking at internal emails. This is completely private communications. And I didn't see anything about, haha, we got them, any kind of thing like that. It's all very sincere.
That's fascinating, isn't it? Because, of course, there are some fewer than at the start of the full-scale war, but there are some that still cling to the idea that this somehow is Putin's war, that the Russian population, even the administration, diplomatic services are held prisoner, as it were, by a psychopathic elite. But it's these kind of everyday communications, and actually, as you say, the sort of commonality of worldview and purpose that really gives the light to that. That doesn't mean that all Russians accept what's going on, but it does mean that unfortunately there are significant numbers outside of just the higher elite who share the same worldview and are not perturbed by what Russia is doing and what Russia would like to do to other European countries.
Yeah, and I see that, there's this kind of continuity. all the way from Pravfond, tied to Russian intelligence services, receives money from the Russian foreign ministry. It's a completely a state, it's created by presidential decree. This organization represents the Russian government. All the way to, okay, now they gave a grant to some organization in Belgium that, does provides legal support to local Russians, and they do a cultural event, and they do a World War II event, and they run a Facebook page that has Russian events. And then you look at the posts on this Facebook page, and you see local Russians living in Belgium who are commenting, and it'll be stuff like a post about Happy May 9th, Happy Victory Day, or it'll be let's remember our forefathers who fought in Stalingrad, and people saying, oh, yes, with tears in my eyes, I recall what my grandma told me about those years, and sort of stuff that in and of itself is not political, but you can see that, that there is that chain that connects them all the way to the Kremlin because they are posting on the Facebook page of an organization that receives money from Pravfond. So it kind of makes you think that, yes, there are a lot of the Russian diaspora. Of course, it includes a lot of people who are against the regime and who fight the regime, and but there are a lot of people who maybe don't think of themselves as political. And if you ask them about the war, they'll say, "Oh, I'm not into politics." But in sort of their general everyday vibe of kind of like, "Yay, happy May 9th," you can see how they're contributing to this kind of worldview and these operations. And it's it would be tricky to assign kind of moral blame, but it certainly speaks to the uh, widespread, presence of these narratives in the minds of ordinary people, and how they are sort of part of this big machine that is wreaking havoc on Ukrainian cities, for example.
And as you say, also targeting Moldova, Poland, Baltics. These are all mentioned in the report there, with various sort of cultural influences, but also support for individuals and organizations that are producing propagandist material. But it seemed the most concerted and political effort was in around these prosecutions of people, as you mentioned earlier, who were supposedly part of the Soviet efforts to suppress Latvian independence, Lithuanian independence, and indeed where there were in that instance where deaths occurred before they decided that really they couldn't win that particular battle, and then the Soviet Union kind of imploded. They seem to go after this with a particular venom and a particular vigor. It also perhaps is interesting, and I'm wait to be standard corrected, perhaps the only instance in history where any Russians have been held accountable for the crimes of the Soviet Union. Why do you think they're going after this particular incident, with such vigor?
Well, in general, we find that the Baltics are a super area of focus. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. We found about 300 or 400 contracts in the emails, and of course, that does not represent everything Pravfond did over its 12 years of existence or so. But of that sample that we found, actual contracts, a large percentage are for those three countries: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and it's. I mean, you can see it because it's like very similar to Ukraine in many ways, that you have a large Russian speaking community there. Of course, the Russians are there in these countries because of the Soviet policy of Russifying them, and trying to displace or at least um, augment the local population with Russians. So uh, that's why, because there's large diasporas here, especially percentage wise compared to the total population, and many of them are dissatisfied. They view themselves as being persecuted or discriminated against, which you could take issue on a human rights, kind of from a human rights framework of some decisions about schooling or language or whatever by the governments of these countries. But Pravfond immediately digs in and takes advantage of that, and kind of tries to weaponize them. And this case of the trial of the Soviet officers is just a perfect battleground. I mean, for Pravfond, it's a perfect opportunity to throw some money at the problem, to then tell their superiors at the foreign ministry, look how we're addressing this horrible injustice that's being visited on our fellow, compatriots. And it's an opportunity to make their case to the world that, these men were just following orders, and this is a blatant, disrespect for Russians, and it's blatant Russophobia, and this just proves again what we're saying, that we're misunderstood and the West is against us. And it's just a perfect battlefield for them. And you can, again, I think it's sincere. You can tell they're kind of outraged about it and they feel offended. And they're holding conferences and meetings, internal and external, public and not public, talking about this and bringing together, authors who are writing books about it and participants from the events. And they say, let's bring, this tank commander from back then who can talk about how, no, I was just doing my patriotic duty. And let's bring an author who's going to publish a book about this. Let's translate this book into Russian. Let's translate this into, there's one that was translated into Italian even. It's just you can tell it's like a painful issue for them that these Soviets are actually facing a courtroom.
And indeed Soviets, a country that ostensibly, or entity that ostensibly no longer exists. But again, there's that idea of commonality that actually modern Russia, Soviet act crimes, there's a continuity there, which the sort of legal labels of these countries would perhaps test against, but they have a different view on it. And indeed, there's some really fascinating quotes inside there where they say the quiet bits out loud. And one of them absolutely fascinates me. This quote is, Russians abroad are an army, a force that is very important to us, is an extension of Russian intelligence services, enabling the control and direction of the Russian-speaking diaspora. Doesn't that quote kind of get to the absolute heart of what this organization is, why it exists, why it's a vector for Russian funds?
Exactly. That's not, that quote, I believe, comes from a promotional video that they made. I don't even know if it was published. I just found a draft of it linked in the emails. But there's other quotes as well. They say this kind of thing all the time. There is a man, I believe, in Belgium who is the head of some local Russian association. He receives money from Fund, and he was holding, I don't remember if he organized it or he was just a prominent participant, but he was in this meeting of how to align Russian media abroad with like Russian narratives. And they mentioned, I looked at the minutes or the schedule or something, and it was talking, the title was like, the Russian media run by our outlets, run by our countrymen, are an opportunity to tell our story to the world. Our story, meaning, of course, the Kremlin's view of Russian history and narratives. So they do absolutely see their quote unquote compatriots as a tool. And yeah, yeah. I mean, it's they don't really even try to hide it. I mean, I think they think it's natural. I think they imagine that every country does this. Probably, they probably think it would be stupid of us not to do this, and it would be inconceivable for us not to try to unite the Russian diaspora around real Russia, which is what we represent at home. I mean, that's the really essence of authoritarianism and dictatorship, right? That they claim to speak for everybody. And as you said, it's not like, a lot of it is supported, open is freely supported by many Russians, but not everybody. But they are not shy about wielding it.
And they probably do, it's a form of projection. They probably do think that we are doing exactly the same sort of thing, even though there is often far less funding and intentionality behind, our soft power outreach. And I shocked somebody the other day when I explained to them that organizations such as the British Council was not just sort of persecuted and handed out of Russia in the 2000s under Putin, that actually I remember very clearly this process began in the 90s, long before Putin took over at the helm. Their staff, especially their ethnic Russian staff, were already under observation, already receiving sort of personal threats and intimidation, and their operations were already being curtailed. And this is 1997. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it, to see how they sort of see this not simply as an offensive weapon, as a way to also counter what they imagine we are intent on doing.
And I think you have to sometimes almost remind yourself, like like it's easy studying this stuff and looking at what the Russians are doing, what the Americans do, what the Brits do, what everybody does, and say, oh, kind of you kind of come to this like, oh yeah, big world powers, and the Russians have their soft power and we have our soft power, and they Europe has their soft power, and everyone is fighting each other, and may the best man win. But it's not at the ground, it's not equivalent. And what I think of to myself is, let's take one example. Let's take Bucha. You know, the Russians will say, look, the Americans are funding journalists who are saying that we committed war crimes in Bucha. We are funding journalists who are saying, no, we didn't commit war crimes in Bucha. So isn't it equivalent? And you have to remember, well, at the bottom of it all is Bucha and those Ukrainians and what actually happened to them. And what literally happened to them is that the Russians murdered them. And there is no two sides to that. Those are the facts. And so one side is, when you have journalists from Voice of America or Radio Free Europe or something who are reporting the truth about that, or for that matter, Russian journalists who are independent and who are supported by grants from Western foundations who are reporting, yes, the Russian military killed civilians in Bucha. And then you have Russian journalists from RT or whoever who are going there and saying no. And it really is not equivalent at the bottom, because really in the end, there are the facts of the case. And so they are paying people to lie, and they are claiming that the West is doing the same thing in reverse. But there is a difference. You have to really get to the bottom of each case and understand that there is a difference. And the same thing in Vilnius, in 1991, civilians were killed by Soviet troops in a country that was trying to break free of the Soviet colonialism. And yes, you can spin narratives for 40 years after the fact, and say that Russians are being discriminated against, but it is a court of law in a country with a democratic country with a real rule of law, and they're trying people for war crimes. So yeah, I find myself having to remind myself of that on occasion.
There's a reality behind it. It's
Yes,
not
that they
just
make you
two
question.
versions
They
of
make you question.
mythology.
They make you question this like very fundamental thing about the world, and you just have to remember that there
And
is
that's
a
part of the
difference.
purpose, isn't it? Is to not necessarily convince you of something, but it's to deflect you and distract you with something else, or convince you that actual reality is so complex. Why even put the hard time and effort in trying to sort of pick apart these narratives? I mean, you are steeped in history and the practice of journalism, so of course you're going to do that. But most people aren't going to put the mental effort in that's required to parse these narratives and try and figure out which is disingenuous and which is not.
It's like after they shot down the airliner in Ukraine, and they didn't even bother coming up with some kind of official narrative. They just threw up 20 different narratives. Oh, maybe it was what could have happened to it, and it's that I never forget that title of that Peter Pomerantsev book. Everything, nothing is true, and everything is possible. That's kind of what they're doing.
That's it. Yeah, my other favorite one is David Satter. It was a long time ago and it never happened anyway, which is another classic sort of take on that. And coming back to this point that Soldatov makes, that it's actually getting more and more difficult for Russian intelligence officers to provide the usual support, to stock the embassies with GRU agents, and to operate through sort of mainstream channels. Actually, organizations like this, Pravfond, they've actually found something that turns out to be, yes, they've been forced to do it this way, but actually it turns out to be rather efficient and rather effective. And we see potentially other organizations coming up that are a little more kinetic than what we're describing here. We're describing informational and legal support. So it's informational warfare and lawfare is fundamentally what this fund is about. But those same outsourced methods are also being used for sabotage, assassination, and far more kinetic operations.
Yeah, and Profund is just part of a much larger ecosystem. As I mentioned, they actually, I remember they, in some of the internal emails, they were saying it's such a big deal. It's so great that now this is being enshrined in the Russian constitution, support for compatriots. So it's part of a state strategy. It extends to all the security services. And yeah, it's of course not just Profund, it's all the embassies and consulates who they work with very closely, and everything else. So it's, yeah, they're pulling all the levers that they have.
And the Russian diaspora. Now, we've talked about the Baltics being the primary target, but actually, when it comes to Russian messaging really cutting through, unfortunately, and working, then we have to mention places like sort of, Global South, South America, parts of the African continent, etc., etc. Do we see evidence that this organization is also operating in these areas? Is it expanding these areas? Because unfortunately, they are a key part of the normalization of Putin's regime on the world stage.
In this case, I didn't remember seeing a lot of cases. I know they're active in Turkey. I know they're active in Jordan. I think even there were some Korean cases, a few American cases. Obviously, that's not global South, but
Yeah.
just thinking of other continents.
Oh,
Yeah, so
Greece as well. That one really stuck out because, of course,
big time.
there's a Greek Orthodox communities in Ukraine, and indeed there are strong connections to Russia of sort of ethnic Greek as well, and probably one of the lowest levels of, dare I say it, sort of cynicism about Russia is actually in Greece and Cyprus. The sort of most pro Russia kind of views can be found there in Europe.
Right. I mean, for this particular organization, they really do focus on compatriots. So it's sort of their reach is a little bit limited based on where there are Russians in the world. So it's going to be obviously much more Baltics. We should also not forget Moldova. They funded a guy to go around Moldova a few months after the full scale invasion to go around giving lectures about Soviet victory in Stalingrad, of all things. And we know Moldova also has a kind of maybe not diaspora, but a population that's very sympathetic to Russian narratives. And we've done separate stories on that, on informational warfare and how, exiled Moldovan oligarch Ilan Shor is sitting in Russia and pumping a lot of money into buying votes against the EU referendum and things like that. So, like, if you're thinking about where could Ukraine happen next, the ones I think of immediately are Moldova and the Baltics, and that's where a lot of that's where they have leverage, and that's where they use it, and that's where Prop Fund is active as well.
The last question really comes from the sort of exposition you got in the report on the Jordanian Center. And here's this really interesting quote, because I think this puts this in some interesting perspective here. It says that their local center in Jordan helped defend a youth organization called Generation Z against radical elements of the Ukrainian diaspora. I guess by radical elements, it means anyone who's pro-Ukrainian rather than necessarily being a radical. But this this sort of brings up a whole topic of radicalization because it seems that this organization we're talking about, it doesn't need to radicalize Russian diaspora. It just needs, and it doesn't need to massively even coerce them, because it seems that there is a compliant and, let's say, fertile soil for people to continue collaborating with the Russian state, despite the full-scale invasion going on, despite the crimes that are being committed. This isn't sort of traditional radicalization, as it were, where you have to really push hard to convince people of something. It looks like they're pushing against an open door in many cases.
Yeah, and we see emails in this archive of people writing into them and saying, look, I'm a patriotic Russian. I live in wherever, Germany, but I do my best here to explain to people, the truth about Ukraine, the truth about Bucha, the truth about Russia's place in the world and how the West is ganging up on Russia. And, please help me. Or, sometimes they're kind of injured, help me. I'm being persecuted because I'm trying to promote Russian narratives here and explain the truth. And I'm not getting any help from the Russian consulate. And isn't it a shame that I'm, such a patriot and I'm doing this and I'm not getting any help? Please help me. So, like, you find people writing to them, they're not, as you said, they're not always kind of reaching out themselves. A lot of what they're doing is responding to things that people are writing in, and grants that people are grant applications that people are sending in and saying, please help me. There's one, I started a Telegram channel in Denmark, and we've got 5,000 followers and we're telling the truth about Russia. Please help us. who uses Telegram in Denmark? Practically nobody. And they actually mention this in their application, and they say because Telegram is almost not used in Denmark, that makes us one of the best, one of the only best resources to present these points of view in this country. And there's another one where I can't remember right now which country it was, but basically they received a set amount of funding year after year after year, and then it got cut one year, and then they kind of sent this very injured letter and saying, "Look, you know, we need this much money to continue our great work on behalf of Russia, and last year we got this much, and now it's being truncated, and this means we can't do our work. Please explain why, and also if you don't increase our funding, we're going to write to the foreign ministry." So there's a lot of they have no lack of things to do and people to send money to, let's put it that way.
Hot griff, but it also sounds like there's a lot of commonality and belief there. People aren't just sort of doing this because it's a way to get money, and that's unfortunate, of course, because it makes it so much more difficult to challenge. And of course, your article is incredibly important, given that it seems that not nearly enough is being done to counter this. We'll put a description in the video, make sure people can sort of see the full report. But it's been great talking to you about this, and they can find more of those sort of personal stories we alluded to in the full article.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.